Psalm 114. Tremble at the presence of the Lord. When Israel went out from Egypt, the house of Jacob from a people of strange language, Judah became his sanctuary, Israel his dominion. The sea looked and fled, Jordan turned back, the mountains skipped like rams, the hills like lambs. What ails you, O sea, that you flee? O Jordan, that you turn back? O mountains, that you skip like rams? O hills, like lambs? Tremble, O earth, at the presence of the Lord, at the presence of the God of Jacob, who turns the rock into a pool of water, the flint into a spring of water. So what can be said of this psalm? A short one, no doubt. So the title, Tremble at the Presence of the Lord, it puts us into a mindset, an understanding of our position relative to God. It's suggestive of a behavior that we should have. And so, of course, we ask the question, why? Why is it that I should tremble in the presence of the Lord? What is this trembling? So when Israel went out from Egypt, the house of Jacob from a people of strange language, Judah became his sanctuary, Israel his dominion. And so we see here the narrative that is the liberation of the Israelites from Egypt, liberation from slavery. From the house of Jacob, they are people of strange language. That is, they speak differently than those of the nations around them. They are a community unto themselves, a community that survived the harshest subjection. And through this testing, and through this strengthening of bonds, through their experience, as slaves in Egypt, Judah, this particular tribe of Israel, could also be interpreted as a specific location. But let's interpret Judah as a tribe that has a particular function. Now Judah, if Judah is to be the sanctuary, it is to be a place or of a community of people, this tribe of Israel, that holds God. Now they don't literally hold God. They hold the Spirit of God. And certainly human beings cannot hold the entirety of the divine way, the divine Spirit, but they hold the principles necessary to communicate with it. And they are strong enough to be able to hold what they are given. And they choose to receive what is offered. And I think in this way, Judah becomes a sanctuary. And also in this way, God's Spirit flows through them. And in the broader context, Israel is his dominion. It is where he rules, because it is within this group of people, within their way, that the spirit survives. We can almost think of it as the people are a sort of host for this spirit. And before we jump to conclusions, we make the analogy of a host and parasite relationship. Although that is sort of an appropriate analogy, it implies predation. It implies selfishness on the part of the organism that chooses to parasitize the host. Rather, in this case, the habitation of this spirit into the host serves not its own purposes, but serves to lift those who choose to accept it and who are able to receive it. And so in this way we see why Israel, why these particular people are God's chosen people. Because these people can hold the principle. The sea looked and fled. Jordan turned back. The mountains skipped like rams. The hills like lambs. Now this is an interesting passage. The sea looked and fled. We have accounted many times that the symbol of the sea can be many things. The symbol of water can be a few different things. But the symbol, when it is combined with the divine direction, provides a degree of certainty to it. It provides a moral standing. And so when I imagine the sea looking, I imagine this force that is on one hand destructive, on the other hand retains within it the potential for renewal and rebirth through this process of destruction. I see a chaotic body that flows back and forth, the sort of carelessness within its waters. So it looked, this carelessness, and it fled. Because it must have seen the very force necessary to put an end to its nature, or rather, possibly to subject the sea to its own desires. And it is, in this case, whatever the sea is looking at, which I perceive to be God. And so as it views God, it trembles. It is in some sense fearful. It's fearful for its own nature. It's fearful for what it means for itself. And it's interesting, this way of talking about things, as though a principle of nature itself can view the countenance of God, and for its part, in this poetic sense, take on human characteristics. And it can be impacted, it can be influenced, just as much as the conscious mind. The sea looked and fled. Jordan turned back. Now I will in a moment refer to what this is obviously referring to, though perhaps difficult to draw a quick conclusion to if we begin to interpret it in the way that I have been interpreting it thus far. If we are to think about the Jordan, which is a river, turning back, in some sense we can think about the reversal of its flow. We could think about the calming of its waters in the same way as we have the sea, which is an analogy, no doubt, to the Red Sea. And when we continue, the mountains skipped like rams, and the hills like lambs. I think what we see here is, again, it has to do with the fundamental principle of nature and its relationship to the conscious mind, and in particular, the relationship to the divine mind. Now we can say this, that, and the other about objects that we experience in our reality behaving in bizarre ways that don't make sense to our immediate intuition. But upon further reflection and interpretation, I think we can draw some conclusions. Even if the conclusions are wrong, the mode of thought, I should say rather, before I continue, that even if our conclusions are wrong in terms of what is intended, we may develop a thought that is useful nonetheless. And so with this in mind, I return to this idea of the principle or law of nature and its communication or interaction with the conscious mind, and moreover the divine mind. The law of nature by itself seems to be this disinterested thing that was set in motion. Perhaps it's vaguely interested, I could say. That is, if there is at all a divine spark in nature, perhaps it lends itself towards unity. In our experience, it seems to have done so. But I'm sure there are many examples in the universe where this is just the opposite. The universe seems to be expanding into nothingness. Rather than condensing into a unity, it's moving into a multiplicity. And so it would be difficult to say that of the nature that we experience, it moves towards some unity, full stop. But we do understand, in our experience, how powerful this unification can be. And so again, I return to this law of nature. And for now we will assume that it is a blank slate in the absence of the conscious mind, in the absence of the divine direction. However, once the characters of this novel enter into it, they give life to this nature. They give direction to its laws. although they are subject to them, they are free to do with them as they please. And when I think about the Jordan and the sea and the mountains behaving, skipping like rams, this image of a massive structure that's powerful, it's tall, it's impressive, it's breathtaking, perhaps. It's seemingly immovable. For it to behave in such a way, to skip like a ram, or the hills to behave like lambs. I think it's indicative of this conscious interaction with fundamental principles of nature. Not necessarily at the level of the atom in this case, but certainly at the level of principle, which may be equivalent to the atom, but it's more general. These principles of nature, we can imagine, are symbols of consistency. And when we see something that is consistently one way, behaving in another, we give pause, because we are not quite sure how to interpret what is happening, because it seems so contrary to our experience. So contrary to our experience in everyday life that it just does not seem possible. And yet, through the human mind, and through a particular way of understanding and of recognition, these principles of nature, in this case, that of chaos and disunion, and that of structure, stability, and of magnitude, they turn around. They jump, again like rams, like lambs. And it's within this conscious understanding of how nature at once appears fixed, but given the introduction of the conscious mind and divine direction, these principles of stability and of chaos, although they remain laws, can be moved. They can be moved into a structure. Just as in a house, we have load-bearing structures, let's say. We have the flooring, we have the ceiling, we have the walls, we have everything within it. And yet, we cannot dissolve these materials and still call it a home. But we can reorganize its foundations to make it appear differently to us. And I think fundamentally, it's within this understanding and within the pursuit and the attempt to organize these foundations, these fundamental principles, in such a way that allow for maximal human flourishing, that is the purpose of man. And this purpose of man, we also understand, is not his own, necessarily, because the self, the heart, the feeling part of man, can be deluded. It can suffer from delusion, from temptation, from false direction. And how could it possibly know the way to aim and the way to go? And how would it possibly succeed if there was no right way? And success, I think, can be, to some, a relative term. Because certainly organisms can succeed through unethical means, perhaps. But therein lies the dilemma. What law in nature decides this ethical standing, this moral hierarchy? If not for some divine source, something that exists outside of our universe, that once the light of intelligibility floods into our universe, we understand that it is from somewhere else, and that all the laws that are within it are for it. It is bound by it. But there's a greater law that exists outside of it. And this law that is outside of it dictates what the thing itself may do. Now, what environment the thing itself operates in, I have no idea. Certainly the physicists have many ideas, but there's no need to go there if we have faith in this source, the source of goodness and intelligibility, of the things that we can't explain within the laws of our nature. Therefore, tremble, O earth, at the presence of the Lord, at the presence of the God of Jacob, who turns the rock into a pool of water, the flint into a spring of water. And here it is looking at us in the face. This interpretation of reality is in verse 8. It is the turning of the nature, the law of our reality, into something that we can use for our own purposes. It is no longer a process, a disinterested process. The conscious mind has flooded this light into it. The rock, at once, this symbol of structure, of a firm quality, something that is entirely separate from a pool of water, something that man can use for his own subsistence. Once this light of intelligibility floods in, this rock can now be used as a pool of water for our own subsistence. It can be used as a tool. And again, it is no longer this disinterested object, this material object. It has provided meaning and purpose. It has utility. The flint into a spring of water. Psalm 115. To your name give glory. Not to us, O Lord, not to us, but to your name give glory, for the sake of your steadfast love and your faithfulness. Why should the nations say, where is their God? Our God is in the heavens. He does all that he pleases. Their idols are silver and gold, the work of human hands. They have mouths, but do not speak, eyes, but do not see. They have ears, but do not hear, noses, but do not smell. They have hands, but do not feel, feet, but do not walk, and they do not make a sound in their throat. Those who make them become like them. So do all who trust in them. O Israel, trust in the Lord. He is their help and their shield. O house of Aaron, trust in the Lord. He is their help and their shield. You who fear in the Lord, trust in the Lord. He is their help and their shield. The Lord has remembered us. He will bless us. He will bless the house of Israel. He will bless the house of Aaron. He will bless those who fear the Lord, both the small and the great. May the Lord give you increase, you and your children. May you be blessed by the Lord, who made heaven and earth. The heavens are the Lord's heavens, but the earth he has given to the children of man. The dead do not praise the Lord, nor do any who go down into the silence. But we bless the Lord from this time forth and forevermore. Praise the Lord. Now we don't praise something that is lower. And so I think the purpose of this introductory verse, not to us, O Lord, not to us, but to your name give glory. It is again this principle that one above should not give honor or give praise to something that is lower. Because fundamentally, honor and praise is given to those who have earned it, those who have proven themselves worthy of it. They have done something in their life that has had a positive impact on the rest of humanity, let's say. And this, of course, is to be considered an action by human beings in the sense of it being just, because we can praise and we can honor all sorts of things in individuals. And these people, these individuals, perhaps these things, these idols, do not have to have any redeemable qualities. Or we can perceive their qualities redeemable, but in reality, in the face of the absolute, they have none of this. And so, we see here the Israelites finding it proper to say, rather than the absolute to give us praise and honor for something that is lower than itself, For if it was to do so, it would lower itself. But to give praise and glory to its own name. So it closes this loop. And it stays in this state of perfection, at least as the human mind conceives of it. And so they say to do so for the sake of the Absolute's steadfast love and its faithfulness. They wish for it to remain where it is in the order of things. And so, verse 2, why should the nations say, where is their God? Our God is in the heavens. He does all that he pleases. Now this question of where is interesting. Because there are many, no doubt, in their day, as there are many in our day, that ask the question of where. They want something immediate. They want something in front of their eyes that they can see. But what I can see doesn't drive me to wake up in the morning. It doesn't initiate communication with somebody that I love. It affords the substrate or the infrastructure upon which I can navigate my own existence. But in terms of the actual journey, I must see things differently in order to be fulfilled as a human being. And so our God is in the heavens, and he does all that he pleases. In this light, we see here in verse 4 a bit of a support for our wanderings, our wandering of mind, that their idols are silver and gold, the work of human hands. Again, it's the immediate, the material, is what lies in front of them. They have mouths but do not speak. They have eyes but do not see. They have ears but do not hear, noses but do not smell. They have hands but do not feel, feet but do not walk. And they do not make a sound in their throat. Those who make them become like them. So do all who trust in them. And so what does this set of analogies refer to? What does it mean to have a mouth but not to speak? Because I think we can intuit here that it is not the case, that these people literally have mouths but cannot speak. Certainly these people can say things, they can verbalize, and we can hear it in the physical sense. But this is not what it means. This is a metaphor that refers to a certain way of speaking and a certain instrument through which this speech flows through, which we consider here to be the mouth. And so, if we consider this in more detail, the mouth must be something that speaks, that provides speech in a certain way. And so what does this mean? Well, it means that this language is not restricted to those that devise idols, to pure material objects like silver and gold, things that appear to their immediate senses as strangely attractive, mystical in their makeup, and because of their mystical nature and of their rarity, they attribute value to it. This is not the way to be. The way to speak and the way to have this proper mechanism by which one can speak, I think, is to speak from a place of certainty, to speak from a place of knowing and of understanding. For what reason should I make my idol silver and gold? What does it mean to me, other than looking interesting compared to all the other objects around me? This is a false sense of the basin in which I place my value, because in the long run this will not fulfill me, as opposed to, say, placing my value within the relationships of those around me, placing my value in understanding and knowing a skill that I may help another, that I may teach another, that I may bring myself to a greater degree of understanding and of peace of mind. They have eyes but do not see. They have ears but do not hear. Noses but do not smell. They have hands but do not feel. Feet but do not walk. And they do not make a sound in their throat. Those who make them become like them. So do all who trust in them. And so it's the interesting sin of the father, sin of the mother type scenario, in which those who behave in one way or act in one way, the only way for this to survive is by finding others who do the same. Because if they were not to do so, they would fundamentally be different from those other people. And here comes in this idea of the foreigner, the stranger, and that of the person of the culture in question. This is the very thing that separates people from one another. It could literally be as severe as speaking a different language. But mostly, if cultures are not to integrate properly, it's because they don't see the same way. They don't hear the same way. They don't feel the same way. And so those who, the expression goes, those of a feather flock together. And so we see here these unseeing, unfeeling, unspeaking people outlining themselves. And they set up this boundary that differentiates them from the others. And in this case, in the moral context, they separate themselves from the truth, from those that live the righteous life, the upright life, the ones who have mouths and do speak, that have ears and do see, etc. O Israel, trust in the Lord. He is their help and their shield. The house of Aaron, trust in the Lord. He is their help and their shield. You who fear the Lord, trust in the Lord. He is their help and their shield. The heavens are the Lord's heavens, but the earth He has given to the children of man. This is an interesting conception. On one hand, we have our world, the world that is given to the children of man, the earth. And then on the other hand, there are the heavens, which are the Lord's heavens. And so this makes it a bit difficult to interpret our reality once we make this distinction. But what can we truly say of it? If it is indeed the case that the heavens are the Lord's heavens, this would seem to imply that the laws by which these rules follow the Lord's laws, and the laws by which we follow are fixed in nature, in the earth. Now, being conscious beings, we have the ability to perceive of the heavens. And it's possible that through this explanation, through this interpretation, we are seeing into a different world. Now, this is an interesting thought, perhaps. This is something that I've heard Elon Musk say recently in one of his podcasts that he had done, when talking about the nature of artificial intelligence. And what exactly it means to be a moral agent. He backed away from analyzing the moral question, but he made the argument, at least he opened the door for the possible argument, that is, that the moral realm is something entirely different. Now, if I was to give my 2 cents on this, I would say that it is likely that it is as it is written here. But I should say with an important distinction. And that important distinction rests upon the idea that this separation between the law of the earthly nature, the material law, everything that we sort of conceptualize in the modern day to be our physics and our chemistry, our fundamental principles, from the heavenly, which is this, what we perceive to be the moral law, that is what ought to be the right and the wrong, the truth of the sophisticated qualities of man, and perhaps of living creatures in general. But to view it in this way, I think, is to fracture our unity. In some sense, they are separate if we are to conceptualize God outside of our universe. Again, this author of the novel, everywhere present, but nowhere seen. The hand of the author writes the story, but it is not as though he is the character in his novel. But we can also understand this reality to be the totality of our reality. That just as much as we can perceive of the divine as we can of the material, that of the earthly, both of these are necessary for an understanding of knowledge and of truth, and of establishing a broader picture of our reality. If we were to separate it for our own purposes, perhaps to deny one for the supremacy of the other, or to dwell highly within one sphere and only moderately in another, I think it has its consequences. Because what is life if it is but a material existence, an indifferent existence, where all of the forms that we can imagine, the poetic forms of the good and of the beauty, of love, if these are just secondary to the mechanistic nature of our environment, then I think what is primary in that society would be that of a state of poverty, a certain type of poverty that is something that we believe and we attribute collectively value to. We place it in a place that is not the highest, we can say. We place it in a place that allows us just to make do, just to get by. But over time, putting something in its wrongful place, when push comes to shove, when the true experience is required, I think placing something of value in a slot that it does not belong in will create tremendous amounts of friction. And eventually this friction will become so unbearable that the problem will have to be dealt with. And I think once we deal with these types of problems, certainly we would experience much suffering, but suffering for the greater good, for a greater purpose. We will fail along the way, but in the end, I think our striving and our hunger to return to a state that is more fulfilling, that allows us to be as we are meant to be, I think this new society will be a magnificent one, because this new one will have all of the tools of the past. And given the unfortunate passing of time from the old societies, and how much we understand that we have lost from them, of their writings and of their buildings, much of this society will be recorded. Much of it will be nonsense. It won't be needed. It won't be seen. But also, a lot of it is quite good. It's quite valuable. Psalm 116. I love the Lord. I love the Lord because he has heard my voice and my pleas for mercy. Because he inclined his ear to me, therefore I will call him as long as I live. The snares of death encompass me. The pangs of Sheol laid hold on me. I suffered distress and anguish. Then I called the name of the Lord. O Lord, I pray, deliver my soul. Gracious is the Lord, and righteous. Our God is merciful. The Lord preserves the simple. When I was brought low, he saved me. Return, O my soul, to your rest, for the Lord has dealt bountifully with you. For you have delivered my soul from death, my eyes from tears, my feet from stumbling. I will walk before the Lord in the land of the living. I believed, even when I spoke, I am greatly afflicted. I said in my alarm, all mankind are liars. What shall I render to the Lord for all his benefits to me? I will lift up the cup of salvation and call on the name of the Lord. I will pay my vows to the Lord in the presence of his people. Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. O Lord, I am your servant. I am your servant, the son of your maidservant. You have loosened my bonds. I will offer to you sacrifice, the sacrifice of thanksgiving, and call on the name of the Lord. I will pay my vows to the Lord in the presence of all his people, in the courts of the house of the Lord. In your midst, O Jerusalem, praise the Lord. So what can we say of this psalm? What does it mean for us to love the Lord? Something that is, on one hand, outside of our everyday experience. It's just not as though we consider a family member, a loved one that is immediately in front of us. It is something that we at once conceptualize. We can abstract it. But also, just as we do with the human being that takes its material form in front of us, I think we can have a relationship with something that is conceived not just as a part of the self, but completely outside of it. A relationship to a force that is out there, a force that brings unity to our understanding. It brings us to a certain level of knowledge. And at the risk of sounding too dilute and void of actual knowledge, I would say that I think we all do this. I think we all seek to understand and be in union with something that is beyond ourselves. Now, whether or not that means that it's this sort of Michelangelo-inspired image of God, that it is this human form, I think we should not delude ourselves into believing things just because there are affordances within the human mind of reasoning and understanding. I don't think it gives us an excuse to delude ourselves into false understanding and to betray our sensibilities. Because it can just as easily be the case that one can use the communication with the divine in order to justify all sorts of phenomena and things in nature, and justify their own feelings, their own behaviors, for which are totally incongruent with what really is true. And so it puts us in a predicament. But, as human beings, I think engaging in dialogue, engaging in finding the center, is what brings us all closer to it. I think, in part, we move closer to it when we feel heard. That is, right or wrong, there's something about what we say, there's something in what we say that we truly believe. We believe it because this and because of that. And we have formed from these separate ideas this unity of thought that we uphold in our minds. And for one to really feel heard is not necessarily that they have to be approved. It's not that they have to be vindicated as though they were on some sort of trial, a trial of certainty, and that if they were to say something wrong, then they would be valued less as a human being. I think when it comes to understanding and of the pursuit of truth, even in the overwhelming circumstance that involves falsehood, that involves one person standing so high above another with such a degree of understanding that is confronted by somebody of such an inferior degree of understanding, let's say, I think there's a way in which the individual of the higher understanding and of the lower can come together. And they can come together in a way that would lift up both parties. And I think if you can do this among two such separate entities, you can do so among any number of entities that find themselves closer together on that spectrum. But to return to this idea of somebody believing so strongly in something that is false, the question is raised, is it the responsibility of the individual that sees the falsehood to convince the one that is believing of the falsehood of the actual truth? And this is a difficult thing to answer, Certainly we can go about it in the wrong way that only influences the individual to dig themselves deeper into their reasoning, that shuts their eyes even tighter, that accepts the darkness over the light. But often, when this is the case, they are saying a type of truth that is the orator of the false statement. But the type of truth that they are stating is hidden. And I think the truth for the individual that doubles down, perhaps, the truth for the individual that refuses to see the truth in something, I think they have something to offer those that know where their mistake lies. And that's why I think, in part, it's possible to engage such people. Now I'm getting in sticky territory here because it doesn't seem to really be going anywhere. So let me try and tie a lot of these loose ends together. And I'll use a practical example. This happened today. I witnessed a conversation between 3 people. 2 people were in a position of authority. 1 person was in a position of acceptance, let's say. Their condition was not acceptance. Their condition was quite combative. But they were accepting the advice of these 2 people that were in a position of authority. And this individual made the argument that they know better than the individuals who are the experts. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean in and of itself that the experts are right and this individual is wrong, given the information that I've provided. However, it was indeed the case that these individuals were right, and I won't go into any particular details about exactly the individual components of this case, because it doesn't matter. We'll accept on faith that this is the way this story goes, and we should focus on the through line here rather than the specific points. So to return to the example, the individual in the position of acceptance say that they knew better. I knew that this person did not know better. The experts knew that this person did not know better. But both parties were continually talking past one another. The experts were saying what they knew to be right, but ignoring the complaints of the individual that they knew to be wrong. And rather than engage in a conversation that was truthful, let's say for the lack of a better term, truthful in the sense of truthful conversation, not in the sense of truthful in terms of who has the upper hand in the argument, who is putting forth the most true statement, but rather truthful in the sense of goodness. Now, what this person that held the false belief was actually saying was that they felt that these people, these experts, were trampling on some fundamental right that this person had. And regardless of the truth that they held, this person did not want their help. Now that's where the true conversation was. And if they just had gotten rid of the superficial layering, they could have had a productive conversation. And instead of talking past one another, needlessly getting both parties upset, they could have been honest with each other and engaged with a dialogue that brought them closer to the center. That's the funny thing about truth, is that some truths need to be reached before others. Some truths need to be reached before others can even be visible, even be considered. Some truths, in this case, it was a bit of what I consider to be a divine truth that needed to be known before this person could have advanced. Advanced in the sense that both parties were on the same heavenly plane, let's say. And being on the same heavenly plane, I think, seems to imply that they understand one another. They understand where one another is coming from. They're properly oriented to one another. They're engaging now in good faith. But if we are to begin with the know better, the truth in the sense of the experts, that had the truth of the scientific understanding, it did not hold any weight in the heart of the individual. And I'm not sure if these two people in the position of authority understood this. Perhaps they won't even think about this conversation. But it was quite an unfortunate thing to witness. It was not my place to interject. But when I read verse 1 here, I love the Lord because He has heard my voice and my pleas for mercy. Because He inclined His ear to me, therefore I will call on Him as long as I live. I think it's just this. It is the sense of being heard. It's a sense of this plea for something. And I think in the example that I gave, this person was pleading for something. Perhaps this person was pleading for mercy. But what came out was anything but a plea for mercy, which is, I think, an interesting bit. Because as that happened, I think what I witnessed was the lower nature coming above the higher and covering it. That is, the undirected feeling bubbling up to the surface. And in the lack of a properly unified and directed thought, let's say, cognitive center point, unity, again, the divine spirit, this godly presence, we can say, anything was allowed to come in and invade this conscious mind and be put forth into this reality. And obviously what came out was nothing conducive. It made absolutely no sense. But I think for the wise person recognizes what's happening. And I think instead of the talking past, the ignoring of the covering, instead of trying to uncover it, they attempt to place their own covering over them, and attempt to force them into a particular direction for which this person just doesn't understand how to even move in that direction, how to follow them, because they're not unified. They're not engaged in that way. And this is not a matter of intelligence. This is not a matter of one being superior and one being inferior, I suppose, even though I sort of made that argument earlier. It's a matter of orientation. And it's not just a matter of orientation. It's the proper orientation. It is the right orientation. And I think this orientation is a process. It can begin at lower levels. It begins at the distance from which one finds themselves away from this divine source, the sort of trunk of the divine tree, let's say, that is of this knowledge, this truthfulness, godliness, divinity, all this sort of thing. And so this distance that one has found themselves away from this source, it's only necessary that in order to begin a conversation, they both have to be oriented, in some sense, to understand where they are in this space. Because if nobody understands where they're at in this space, how are they going to walk in any direction at all? They don't even know where they are in relationship to the center. And so, again, I return to this idea of being heard as being fundamental, because I think to be heard is to understand where this person is in space. Not only to understand where they are relative to you, but also to understand where both parties are in relationship to this this divine tree, the tree of divinity, the tree of knowledge, whatever you want to call it. The snares of death encompass me. The pangs of Sheol laid hold on me. I suffered distress and anguish. Then I called on the name of the Lord. O Lord, I pray, deliver my soul. Now this snare of death that encompasses one, I think it's easy to immediately think of the literal death. That is the end of existence of the individual. Now, when I say that, I don't discount that as being an interpretation. But I think there is a broader principle here that at the very least we should remember. And that the idea of death is not just the death of the body or death of the individual self, but it can apply to an individual as they transform into something else. And as they transform, the old dies and the new is born. And so to say, the snares of death encompass me, the pangs of Sheol laid hold on me, I suffered distress and anguish, then I called on the name of the Lord. O Lord, I pray, deliver my soul. And it's not O Lord, I pray, deliver my body. That's not, O Lord, I pray, deliver my mind. It is, O Lord, I pray, deliver my soul. But let's rewind for a moment here and talk about the second line. The pangs of Sheol laid hold on me. Now we've described on many different occasions what this place of Sheol is. But since we are going to be discussing it here, it's worth mentioning again. Now Sheol is a place of, in one sense, it's a place of darkness. It's something that can be seen as beneath the earth. Sort of an underworld, a realm of the dead, possibly. But dark and gloomy, I think, are the adjectives that describe this place. It has also been referred to as a place of rest and of sleep. And so we have different sort of ideas of this place. Certainly, in our own experience, as we lay our head to rest at night, we experience this Sheol. We go into the depths of the darkness. The conscious mind slips into slumber, and for 8 hours or so, we are completely absorbed in this nothingness, in this darkness. Of course, we can have dreams and so forth, but fundamentally, really most of our experience when we are sleeping, we are unaware of when we wake up. And this sort of sensation, or this experience of not necessarily the failure of consciousness, but of the suppression of it, of its transmutation into something lesser, more of a dulled experience. And as we can imagine, I think there are levels to this Sheol. Certainly as one goes down into the depths, they experience this gradation and the gradual dimming of the light of the mind and of the recognition of the self and the holding on to of the reality that the form of the human being inhabits. So with this conception of Sheol, if it is to lay hold of somebody, that means, in my interpretation, that it is pulling somebody down into its depths, and they are experiencing this gradual decline in understanding, this gradual decline in engagement with the world, with attentiveness. It's all wound up in this experience that one goes through as they remove the conscious mind from its profound ability to experience the reality that it finds itself in. Now, if one is to go through this experience as we see the author referencing here, I would imagine that it would be quite unsettling. And just before they reach the precipice, the point at which there is no return, the point at which gravity takes over and there is no grasping for a place where they can pull themselves up. Of course, we can use another analogy. It doesn't have to be as dramatic as a precipice. It could be something more akin to a slide, where it's not impossible to pull yourself up, but very, very difficult once the incline increases. And so the author states that the remedy to this was the call to the name of the Lord. the call to the very thing that provides the intelligibility of the universe to the mind, the antidote to the descent into this ever more darkness as one descends down into it. The antidote, again, is to call upon the name of the Lord. And so just as we can imagine this pit of Sheol, we can imagine the antithesis of this pit, that of this elevation, this pillar of stability upon which we can stand to maintain some self-identity. Now, this is not the place to go into one of our discussions about the nature of the self and how dangerous the self can be to man's existence, just as Sheol is dangerous to man's existence. So we will put that aside for now. But in this context, as the self faces dissolution, we recognize the importance of it, regardless of its potential dangers. And so the author says, "O Lord, I pray, deliver my soul. Deliver my being from the nothingness. Deliver my soul." And it's a very powerful image. It's a very poetic image. It's a very strong image. It's a fundamentally human thing, a human experience. And so we move from this place of being heard, of being understood, of bringing into the truth, into some unity. And we have the commitment, after experiencing this this moment, or whatever you want to call it, this understanding of being heard, we also have the recognition of sort of simultaneously what is happening to this person. They are falling down into the depths of Sheol. They recognize the importance of being heard so that they can orient themselves in relationship to the world and the reality that they find themselves in. And yet they find themselves trying desperately to stop this descent into the nothingness, into the void. And so they reach out, or they call out upon the name of the Lord so that they can be heard. Again, we're sort of going back through this circle, but it's worth repeating because of how fundamental I think that this is to our experience. And so what does this mean on a practical level? Well, I think it has to do with levels. I think it has to do with gradation. So just as we mentioned the experience of falling asleep, we can imagine the experience of waking up, coming out of this state. That is, the state after one calls to the Lord. The prayer is answered for the deliverance of the soul. And then there begins this process of deliverance and of salvation. And I think it is fundamentally the opposite of that one experiences when they fall into sleep. It is the wakefulness. Now, when one wakes from sleep, it's not as though they are at their optimum functioning. They require a certain period to adjust to the reintroduction of the conscious mind, the sort of the ignition of the engine that is the physiology of our being of our makeup, of our physical makeup. All of this componentry, the components that are necessary to facilitate the functioning of the mind need to take place. And I think that there are practices that we can partake in that increases the efficiency, that leads us closer to God. And the process of salvation and of deliverance is that very thing. Now, some people find it going to church, raising a family, having close friends. I think these are very fundamental. Love is probably the highest thing that we can pursue that will wake us up to it. But also, things like meditation, focusing one's attention, exercise, commitment to study, reading, all of these things engage the mind. Of course, they have to be directed. You can focus all day on attention, but focusing on attention itself is not enough. It's using your ability to focus your attention in a particular direction. And so this is the fundamental exodus of Sheol. It's the wakefulness of the mind. It's the man that leaves the Platonic cave and finds himself into this new, enlightened sense of reality. That just like sleep, just like at every level, it requires a period of acclimation. We are not as we are at just after waking up at 5 in the morning, as we are at 9 a.m., 10 a.m., 11 a.m. And to zoom out a little bit from a seemingly simple analogy, if we are to examine our life, the same principle I think applies to the maturity of the individual, that of growing up from an infant to being an adolescent, to young adulthood, to being an adult. All these experiences, all of this growing takes place that serves, if directed properly, to enlighten the mind and to relieve one of the sharp insult or the pangs that Sheol may grab us by, or may pierce us by. It's the liberation of this distress and of anguish. And so we have the analogy of the sleep and wake. We have the analogy of the growth of the individual throughout the lifespan. We can say of this, at the level of the collective, that at the fundamental level of the family, that of the nation. We could think about it in terms of a corporate body. Anything and everything that involves a human being goes through this process. It adheres to the divine principle, to this divine principle, because it is fundamentally bound by its laws, which of course are fixed by the everlasting. And so we say, glorious is the Lord, and righteous our God is merciful. The Lord preserves the simple. When I was brought low, he saved me. Return, O my soul, to your rest, for the Lord has dealt bountifully with you. And so that last verse, verse 7, is an interesting one. Return, O my soul, to your rest, for the Lord has dealt bountifully with you. Because now we have, I might make a stretch here, but I think it is an appropriate analogy. we have another almost conception of this Sheol-like state, which is a state of rest. Because within this state of rest, we cease to strive upwards. Everybody needs rest. Nobody is at 100% all of the time. But therein lies an interesting dilemma. It is the interaction with the principle, again, of falling back into the Sheol. But in this context, and this is fundamental here, context is everything. Once one has gone through this process of awakening and of putting in the work, the effort, the discipline, the attention necessary to move themselves up onto a higher plane of being, then they are allowed this rest. For if they did not put forth the effort, their rest would only serve to dilute their sense of being and to bring it lower than the state prior. Now again, to return one more time, to repave this road. When one rests after the process that we have described of discipline and of adherence to practice, righteously directed or justly directed, whatever you want to call it, the upright walking, the upright path. Once they have done this, then rest is not only deserved but also necessary, so that they may continue in the future. And rather than this rest, or this mode of descent, that in some sense can be seen as a bit of a descent into Sheol, serves to reinvigorate them, so that when they awake, not only do they retain what they have gained from their exploits, from their discipline, but also now they are on a step higher than from that previous rest. And now, on this day, this new day, we can take another step up, and we can continue this journey throughout our life. And by the end of our life, we feel fulfilled and accomplished because of the steps that we have taken and the heights that we have reached. For you have delivered my soul from death, my eyes from tears, my feet from stumbling. I will walk before the Lord in the land of the living. And so another interesting conception. It's a bit of a building upon the experience that we've seen thus far in the psalm. And so now we see this person that has gone through the recognition, the importance of being heard, the reaching out, and the grabbing onto of something that can free themselves, that can liberate them from the pit of darkness, to the recognition and the effectiveness, the recognition of the effectiveness of this approach. And understanding the proper orientation of the individual to this rest and the pit of darkness. And now after some time, I would have to imagine, their soul has been delivered from this death. And so now we can see here that this is not really the physical death, unless, of course, we choose to talk about the context in which the individual human life is not of primary concern. And that, of course, would be something like the level of the collective, where we're talking about an identifiable spirit of man that inhabits a body of individuals, rather than just the individual and his or her body. But let's forget that for a moment. and return to our interpretation, which is the individual that is going through this process. Now they are liberated from the tears that come from this existential suffering, that don't understand how, if one is to engage and to succumb to these emotions, they feel themselves slipping. And it's interesting that this next line is, my feet from stumbling. That is, for you have delivered my feet from stumbling. I will walk before the Lord in the land of the living. Now fundamentally, the land of the living is the opposite direction of the pit, or what they consider Sheol to be. For Sheol is not only a place of darkness and dullness for the living, but it is also, at its basement, at its fundament, the place of the dead. For they cannot be, for that is their final resting place. It's the ultimate form of this dulled and dead perception, where there is no light of conscious mind within it. It's the perishing of the body and mind that we will all find one day. But I just mentioned that to give an illustration of the scope of this pit, to give it some volume. And so again, the land of the living, I will walk before the Lord in the land of the living, is a commitment because of the experience that they have gone through thus far. I believed, even when I spoke, I am greatly afflicted. I said in my alarm, all mankind are liars. So perhaps here we have a bit of a lament at one's previous conceptions and behavior. The sort of self-inflation in the quote that they gave, I am greatly afflicted. Because prior to their revelation, everything was about this self and appeasing this self. And there's a bit of a paradox that comes in here in my mind, because we sort of began talking about the self, and at the time I wanted to avoid, because many past episodes we've talked about the dangers of this overinflation of the self. But there is a true dilemma in the experience of man that has to do with the relationship of self to the divine. And it is within our modern conception that the self should be liberated so that the individual is responsible for its communication with the everlasting, with the ever after, with God. Now it opens up a can of worms, because it is possible that the very thing that set in motion this cascade of going down into the depths, sort of understanding and recognizing that one needs God to move them up out of it, it's very possible that that descent is due to the overinflation of the self, of pride. And we see here in this verse 10, I believed even when I spoke. I am greatly afflicted. Now, I think there are a number of different ways that this can be interpreted here, but we have to pick a thought. We have to pick a through line to follow. And so I will go with this overinflation of the self. I believed even when I spoke. I am greatly afflicted. I said in my alarm, all mankind are liars. And I think this is a bit of a repentance. I think I've said this before, but it's worth saying again. It's a repentance to the way this person was. All mankind are liars. I am greatly afflicted. This is profoundly negative. These sorts of principles lead one down into the pit, to the depths. If all mankind are liars, then I myself is a liar. Of course, I don't speak truth all the time. I'm not a perfectly truthful human being. There are things that I just do not know in the moment, and so I live the best I can with my understanding. Is it possible that I may lie or live a lie in some aspect of my life? Certainly. I'm not perfect. But to say that all mankind are liars, in one sense is true, but in another sense, if it's believed without the idea of this salvation, this direct redemption, or this deliverance, it's a nasty business. You accompany that with the overinflation, the self-pitying, the ego, and it's a recipe for disaster. It's a rocket engine straight for the earth. What shall I render to the Lord for all his benefits to me? I will lift up the cup of salvation and call on the name of the Lord. I will pay my vows to the Lord in the presence of all his people. Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. O Lord, I am your servant. I am your servant, the son of your maidservant. You have loosened my bonds. I will offer to you the sacrifice of thanksgiving and call on the name of the Lord. I will pay my vows to the Lord in the presence of all his people. In the courts of the house of the Lord, in your midst, O Jerusalem, praise the Lord. And so there's not much to be said of that last bit. It is this sort of... We've gone through a pretty intense experience, really, in such a short amount of time, or rather such a short amount of words. It conveys an incredible message. And the last few verses are really just a solidification and a commitment to this newfound salvation. Psalm 117. The Lord's faithfulness endures forever. Praise the Lord, all nations. Extol him, all peoples. For great is his steadfast love towards us, and the faithfulness of the Lord endures forever. Praise the Lord. Probably the shortest psalm of the Psalms, and also very straightforward. A quick and easy reminder. A good follow-up to the previous psalm. And that's where we will end it. We will begin next time with Psalm 118, titled, His Steadfast Love Endures Forever.